Captain Sarah Mitchell hadn't heard her military rank spoken aloud in 3 years, and she preferred it that way. The sound of it felt alien now, like a language she'd learned decades ago but no longer spoke. She had surrendered everything, the medals gathering dust in a cardboard box under her bed, the authority that once commanded rooms of seasoned operators, the classified operations she could never speak about, not even in therapy, for something simpler: silence. Silence was her currency now. Silence was survival. Her sailboat, the Perseverance, was anchored in the crystalline waters off the Oregon coast, bobbing gently beneath a gray autumn sky that seemed to match her mood perfectly. The boat was her world. 42 feet of white hull and weathered wood, with a cabin that smelled of salt, diesel fuel, and the faint ghost of coffee from the thermos she'd emptied that morning. She'd saved for 7 years while still active duty to buy this vessel, scraping together leave days and reinvesting hazard pay, dreaming of the day she could trade combat boots for bare feet on a teak deck. That day had finally come, though not in the way she'd imagined. Not because she'd decided to retire. Because the military had finally accepted what she'd known for months. She was broken, and they couldn't fix her. The people in the small harbor town of Crescent Bay knew her only as the quiet woman with haunted eyes who appeared every Tuesday morning at the local coffee shop, ordered a medium dark roast without sugar or cream, and never made eye contact. She paid cash, tipped exactly 18%, and left before the barista could finish saying, "Have a great day." That was the extent of her social interaction. The marina owner assumed she was grieving a lost relationship. The grocery store clerk thought maybe she was on some kind of recovery program. The teenage kid who pumped her fuel guessed she was just naturally antisocial. None of them were wrong, and none of them were right. What they couldn't see were the scars, not the physical ones, though there were plenty of those too. There was the long white line on her left shoulder where shrapnel from an IED had carved through muscle and tendon in Kandahar. The 3-inch keloid on her ribs where field surgeons had performed an emergency procedure in a tent. The smaller marks on her hands and arms, each one a story of a mission that had gone wrong in some way. But those were just skin. The real damage was deeper. The real scars were the ones that woke her at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, with her heart trying to escape through her ribs. They were the ones that made her hands shake for no reason while she was reading a book, just because a car had backfired somewhere in the distance. They were the ones that convinced her, absolutely convinced her, that trusting another human being was a guaranteed path to catastrophe. Because she trusted people, worked alongside them, bled with them, and buried them. 5 of them. She could recite their names like a prayer. Marcus, Elena, James, David, and Ahmed, the interpreter who'd saved her life and lost his own doing it. The Perseverance was her therapist, though a therapist would have cost $200 an hour and at least demanded that she speak about her feelings. The boat asked nothing except maintenance and respect. It never pushed her to process her trauma or work through her emotions. It simply existed, solid and real, and allowed her to exist beside it. She spent her days maintaining the engine, sanding the railings, checking the lines, inspecting the sails. Her hands were nearly always dirty now, calloused in different ways than they'd been when she held a rifle. These were the calluses of honest work, of creation rather than destruction. She'd chosen the Oregon coast deliberately. It was far enough from military installations that she wouldn't run into anyone from her old life. The weather was unpredictable, which appealed to her need for an element of controlled chaos. The water was cold enough to make her feel alive, to burn away the numbness that had become her default state. And the town was small enough that people didn't ask questions, but kind enough that they didn't exclude her. It was perfect precisely because it demanded nothing. 3 years of relative peace. 3 years of waking without nightmares maybe once a week instead of every single night. 3 years of sailing the same routes, anchoring in the same spots, falling into rhythms that felt almost like healing. She'd learned the names of the local fishermen, not by choice but through repeated contact. She'd nodded at the same dog walkers on the dock. She'd even been invited to something, a community event, maybe a potluck, which she declined with the kind of politeness that suggested she might say yes next time, though they both knew she wouldn't. The water became her meditation. On good days when the weight on her chest was lighter, she'd sail out for hours, letting the wind carry her away from land, away from people, away from the part of her that still expected gunfire. She'd learned to trust the ocean in a way she no longer trusted humans. The ocean was honest. It wouldn't pretend friendship while planning your demise. It wouldn't make promises it couldn't keep. If it wanted to kill you, it would tell you with gray skis and rising waves. It wouldn't smile and shake your hand first. The locals in the small harbor town called her the quiet captain when they spoke about her at all. She was a fixture, like the old lighthouse on the point or the weathered boat repair shop that had been closed for 2 years. People constructed narratives about her to fill the silence. Widow, recluse, artist seeking inspiration, writer in need of solitude. Each guess was equally wrong and equally harmless. None of them suspected that the woman who nodded politely in the grocery store had once coordinated operations involving 30 people across 3 countries, that she'd made life-and-death decisions in nanoseconds, that she'd killed people and been killed by the memories of doing so. The Perseverance was anchored in her favorite spot that Tuesday morning, a secluded area where the water was deep enough to feel safe, but shallow enough that she could see the sandy bottom on clear days. She was elbow-deep in engine grease, her hands stained black beyond any hope of cleaning, lost in the meditative work of understanding how this machine worked, how she could keep it running, how she could maintain at least one thing in her life with competence and control. The sun was climbing higher, the air was crisp without being cold, and for the first time in weeks, she'd gone an entire hour without thinking about Ahmed's face. It was progress. Small, incremental, but real. She had no idea that this peace was about to be shattered. The sound came without warning, a deep, aggressive engine roar that shattered the fragile peace Sarah had carefully cultivated over 3 years. She was beneath the waterline of her boat, elbow-deep in engine grease, her hands stained black and her mind in that meditative state that only came from focused mechanical work. Her head was bent close to the diesel engine, her breathing steady, her body relaxed in a way that had become increasingly rare. She was checking the fuel injectors, a meticulous task that required absolute concentration and the kind of methodical thinking that kept her demons at bay. The rumble started low and distant, the kind of sound that might have been part of the ocean background, a boat passing in the distance perhaps, or the wind in the trees on shore. But Sarah's nervous system knew better. Her entire body went rigid before her conscious mind could fully register what she was hearing. Every muscle fiber tensed simultaneously. Her hand froze mid-motion. Her breathing became shallow and sharp, almost a gasp. In less than a second, she'd been transported out of peaceful meditation and into a state of high alert, the same neurological state that had kept her alive in combat zones. The sound grew louder and more distinct, an engine that wasn't meant for pleasure, a mechanical growl with an almost military precision to it. Sarah's heart rate spiked dangerously fast. Her hands trembled as she withdrew them from the engine compartment, leaving greasy handprints on the white fiberglass interior. She told herself to breathe, to think rationally, to remember that she was safe and that engines made this sound all the time. But her amygdala, that ancient part of her brain that had been shaped by years of combat, knew better. Her body was preparing for a threat. She climbed the cabin steps slowly, deliberately, using the physical act of movement to ground herself in the present moment. Through the porthole, a circular window that suddenly felt like it was closing in on her, she caught her first glimpse of the vessel. White hull, gleaming in the autumn sunlight, official insignia clearly visible even at a distance. United States Coast Guard. The letters seemed to glow on the side of the cutter as it cut through the water with mechanical precision, its engines dominating the soundscape that had, just moments ago, been filled only with the gentle cry of seagulls and the soft lap of waves against the hull. Her throat went dry. Sarah emerged topside slowly, deliberately calm, wiping her hands on an already filthy rag that had seen better days months ago. The movement was automatic, trained behavior designed to appear normal, to appear harmless, to appear like a person who had nothing to hide. But her senses were hyper-alert. She noted everything: the angle of the sun, the direction of the wind, the position of the other boats in the harbor, the location of her radio, the exits from her vessel, the depth of the water around her. Combat training never really left you. It just waited in your nervous system for moments like these. The Coast Guard cutter was slowing as it approached, its engines throttling down. Sarah could see two uniformed officers on the deck, scanning the water with purposeful intensity. They weren't here for a friendly chat. She could read it in their posture, in the way they moved with the kind of official gravity that suggested something was wrong. Very wrong. Her mind raced through possibilities at lightning speed. Had she violated some regulation she didn't know about? Was there a recall on her safety equipment? Had someone reported her? She'd been so careful to stay invisible, to follow every rule, to not give anyone any reason to look in her direction. The entire point of the Perseverance was to disappear into legitimate existence, to be just another boat in just another small harbor, drawing no attention from authorities or anyone else. The thought that this plan might have failed, that something she'd done or hadn't done might have triggered an official response, made her stomach twist painfully. A rubber boarding vessel, the kind used for inspections, was being prepared on the cutter's deck. Sarah watched the officers move with professional efficiency, and she understood that this wasn't random. They weren't checking every boat in the harbor. They were here for her specifically. The question was why. The boarding vessel cut through the water toward the Perseverance, and Sarah gripped the railing of her boat, her knuckles turning white. She forced herself to let go, to relax her hands, to control her breathing. Panic would serve no one. She'd learned long ago that panic killed you in certain situations. The trick was to stay sharp, to stay calm, to think 5 moves ahead, to never give anyone ammunition they could use against you. The rubber boat pulled alongside with a soft bump, and 2 uniformed officers approached. They were both young, younger than her, certainly, with the kind of physique that came from rigorous training. One was taller with sandy hair and a face that hadn't yet learned to hide emotion. The other was compact and muscular, with the kind of eyes that had seen something, though perhaps not the things Sarah had seen. Both wore duty weapons at their hips, and both wore the expression of men who'd been trained to assume the worst of people until proven otherwise. "Captain Mitchell, we need to conduct an inspection," the senior officer announced, his voice clipped and formal, the kind of tone that left no room for negotiation. The younger officer was already scanning the deck of the Perseverance with obvious suspicion, as though he expected to find contraband or weapons or evidence of some terrible crime stacked neatly on the cabin top. Sarah's mind screamed internally, a sound of pure alarm that she kept locked behind her teeth. They knew her name. They'd come prepared. This was official, documented, on the record. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady, and even though internally she was performing calculations about worst-case scenarios. If they seized her boat, where would she go? If they arrested her, who would she call? She didn't have a lawyer. She barely had friends. Most of the people she'd known before had moved on to civilian lives that she couldn't quite manage to fit into. "We received reports of an unregistered vessel in restricted waters," the senior officer replied, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Your registration status is in question. We need to verify your documentation and conduct a safety inspection. It's standard procedure." Standard procedure. Those words had different meanings depending on whether you were on the side of the officer or the civilian. For officers, standard procedure was cover, was protocol, was the bureaucratic shield that protected them from accountability. For civilians, it was the beginning of a process that could spiral in any direction, could uncover any number of technical violations, could result in consequences they couldn't predict or control. Sarah nodded slowly, her training overriding her fear. She'd been in situations before where she'd had to comply with orders from people who outranked her, who had authority she didn't possess, who could make her life very difficult with a single radio call. The difference was that back then, she'd been part of the same organization. Now, she was on the other side of that equation, and the power imbalance felt suddenly terrifying. "Of course," she said, and watched as the officers' faces tightened, watching as they boarded her boat, watching as her sanctuary became a crime scene waiting to happen. Sarah's hands were still stained with engine grease as she moved toward her cabin, but she didn't pause to clean them. The officers had positioned themselves on either side of the main hatch, their posture making clear that this was a controlled situation, that she was the subject of suspicion, not a fellow citizen to be respected. She'd learned long ago that small gestures mattered in situations like this. Going below deck without hesitation, without making a show of searching for documents, suggested confidence and legitimacy. Making excuses or appearing flustered would only confirm their suspicions. The cabin below was small and organized, everything in its place the way military training had taught her to keep things. The documentation was in a waterproof folder in the galley, filed with the kind of obsessive care that came from having spent years maintaining classified intelligence documents. She could recite everything in that folder from memory: registration number, permit dates, safety certification expiration, insurance details. Every single item current and legal. Every single requirement met. She'd made certain of it because the last thing she needed was complications with federal agencies. She retrieved the folder and climbed back topside, handing it across to the senior officer with a calm that belied the way her heart was hammering in her chest. "Everything is current," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "Registrations, permits, safety certifications. I keep meticulous records." The senior officer took the folder and opened it with deliberate slowness, scanning the contents. His expression didn't change much. He'd been trained not to reveal information through his face, but Sarah could see the moment he began reading the permit documentation. She watched his jaw tighten slightly, watched his eyes move across the page with the focused intensity of someone reading something unexpected. "These are dated 3 years ago," he said, more as an observation than a question. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "I renewed them myself last spring. The renewal should be in there as well." The officer flipped through the pages methodically, and Sarah felt a creeping sense of wrongness crawl up her spine. She'd reviewed these documents obsessively during the renewal process. She'd done everything exactly as instructed, had filled out every form, had submitted everything the website said she needed to submit. She was absolutely certain, or at least she had been certain until this moment. The younger officer had moved slightly closer, his eyes on Sarah's face now rather than her documentation. He was watching her reaction, measuring her response, looking for the micro-expressions that would betray dishonesty or evasion. Sarah knew this game well. She'd been on both sides of these interviews. She understood that her calm demeanor would either reassure him or make him more suspicious, depending entirely on how his superior officer handled the situation. "The zone classification for your anchorage," the senior officer said slowly, "was updated 6 weeks ago." The words landed like a physical blow, though Sarah kept her face from showing it. 6 weeks. That was. Her mind calculated rapidly. That would have been right after she'd submitted her renewal, right before the processing would have gone through. It would have been after she'd last checked the zone status. "I wasn't notified of a zone reclassification," she said carefully, each word measured. This was important. This was the difference between a simple misunderstanding and something more serious. "A notice was filed in the Federal Registry," the officer replied, his tone taking on that quality of practiced, bureaucratic certainty. "As is standard procedure. Your permit was valid at the time of issuance, but the zone change retroactively affects its current validity." Sarah's mind was working through the implications rapidly. If what he was saying was true, and she had no reason to believe he was lying, then she was in violation through no fault of her own. She'd done everything right, submitted everything on time, and the federal government had changed the rules without informing her. It was infuriating. It was also, from a legal standpoint, not her problem. Or rather, it was her problem, but it wasn't supposed to be a catastrophic one. "Can you show me the official notice?" she asked, keeping her voice polite but firm. "I'd like to see what the reclassification parameters are." The senior officer's expression shifted, barely perceptibly, but Sarah caught it. It was the look of someone who wasn't accustomed to being questioned, who expected compliance rather than inquiry. "The notice is available on the Federal Registry," he said, his tone cooling. "You're responsible for checking regulatory updates." "I do check regulatory updates," Sarah replied, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath it. "Regularly. Which is why I noticed this notification didn't come through any of the services I subscribe to. Which is why I have no record of it, despite maintaining meticulous records of all official communications." "Regardless," the younger officer interjected, "we have probable cause to conduct a full inspection. This zone has been flagged for increased enforcement." Probable cause. The words hung in the air between them like a threat. Sarah understood what those words meant. They meant the officers could expand their search, could look into every compartment of her boat, could confiscate anything that caught their attention. They meant she'd lost the last bit of control over her own space. "I want to see your warrant," Sarah said, pulling on every ounce of training she possessed to keep her voice level. It was a legal right, one she was entitled to, but it was also a challenge. She could see it register on both officers' faces as defiance, as resistance, as something to be overcome rather than respected. "We don't need a warrant for a safety inspection of a vessel in federal waters," the senior officer stated flatly. "That's federal maritime law." Sarah knew this was true, or at least that they believed it was true. She also knew that there were legal gray areas here, that maritime law was complex, and that federal authority over vessels was an area with competing jurisdictions. But she also knew that arguing legal points with armed federal officers standing on her boat was not going to end well for her, regardless of who was right. "Then I'd like to see the documentation of the zone reclassification," she said instead, trying to regain some footing, "so I can understand exactly what violation I'm being cited for." The senior officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Sarah read it instantly: irritation, slight uncertainty, a recalibration of how they were going to proceed. She'd done something unexpected. She'd been cooperative without being compliant, respectful without being submissive. She'd asked for information rather than simply accepting their authority. It was throwing them slightly off balance. "We'll need to inspect the full vessel," the senior officer announced, his voice taking on an official tone that suggested documentation was being recorded. "Standard safety inspection. You'll cooperate fully, or we'll be citing you for obstruction of federal personnel." There it was, the threat barely veiled. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that she'd reached the limit of what pushback would accomplish. These men had authority, and they were clearly prepared to use it. Resisting further would only make things worse. But as she watched them move toward her cabin, toward the spaces that were supposed to be her sanctuary, Sarah felt something harden inside her. Something that had been quiet for 3 years, something that had been sleeping but not dead. And she understood that whatever happened next, whatever violation she was about to experience, it would be harder to come back from than the first time. The inspection began with the senior officer moving through the cabin with the kind of methodical thoroughness that went far beyond a routine safety check. He wasn't looking for expired flares or faulty wiring. He was looking for something else entirely, something that would justify his suspicion, something that would validate his decision to board this vessel and treat its captain like a criminal. Sarah understood the psychology of it. He'd already decided she was guilty of something. Now he was simply searching for what that something might be. The younger officer had positioned himself at the entrance to the cabin, physically blocking Sarah's only route of escape, though escape from her own boat felt surreal even in her thoughts. He was watching her with the intensity of someone trained to read body language, to detect deception, to observe the microexpressions that betrayed guilt. Sarah kept her face neutral, but internally she was calculating the worst-case scenarios with the precision of someone who'd spent years planning for contingencies. "You live aboard permanently?" the senior officer asked, his eyes scanning the sleeping quarters. The small bunk with its neatly folded blanket, the single pillow without a pillowcase, the small shelf of books, the absence of any photographs or personal mementos. "Yes," Sarah replied, "for the past 3 years. No permanent address." "This is my permanent address. The Coast Guard actually recognizes vessels as domiciles for tax and legal purposes." Her response was technically accurate, but she could see it annoyed him. She was demonstrating knowledge of regulations, was asserting her rights through reference to the law, was refusing to play the role of confused civilian he seemed to want her to play. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she caught it. She'd been trained to catch those things. The officer moved to her storage locker, a metal cabinet where she kept her engine parts, tools, and various supplies. He opened it without asking, his hands moving through her possessions with a proprietary carelessness that made something hot and angry rise in her throat. She forced it down, locked it behind her teeth, reminded herself that this was temporary, that she was in control of her own reactions even if she wasn't in control of the situation. "These tools," he said, pulling out a socket wrench set. "Unauthorized modifications to the vessel." "Engine maintenance," Sarah said calmly. "I do my own mechanical work." "You're not a registered mechanic." "I'm the owner. I'm entitled to maintain my own vessel." The officer continued his slow examination, moving from the galley to the navigation station. Sarah watched him handle her charts, her instruments, her carefully maintained logbook where she recorded every journey, every weather observation, every mechanical issue and repair. It was all legitimate. It was all legal. But the intensity with which he was examining it made her feel violated in a way that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with autonomy. "I'm going to need to see your vessel's documentation folder again," he said, not asking but demanding. "And I'll need to photograph everything for the report." Report. There would be an official report. This incident, this violation she hadn't committed, would be documented in federal databases. It would become part of her record, would potentially flag her for future inspections, would follow her in ways she couldn't predict or control. Sarah retrieved the folder again and watched as the officer began photographing each page with his official phone, each image time-stamped and presumably uploaded to a federal database somewhere. He was creating a paper trail, an official record that she was being investigated. The very thing she'd tried to avoid by disappearing into quiet obscurity. "The vessel will need to be held pending investigation of the zone violation," the senior officer announced, speaking in that professional tone that meant he was now following official protocol, was covering himself legally, was making sure that whatever happened next couldn't be traced back to his judgment. "I'm in violation?" Sarah asked, her voice still calm but with an edge underneath it now. The anger she'd been suppressing was beginning to leak through her careful control. For having permits that were valid when issued, in a location that was legal to be in at the time, and that's now in violation due to regulatory changes I had no notice of. "That's correct," he said flatly. "Federal maritime law is clear. You're responsible for maintaining current permit status." "A notice was filed in a federal registry," Sarah repeated his earlier words back to him. "Without notification to existing permit holders. That seems like a gap in the regulatory process, not a violation on my part." The senior officer's face hardened. "I suggest you stop arguing with me about the law. You're not a lawyer. I am conducting an official federal inspection, and you are required to cooperate. If you continue to be uncooperative, I will have to cite you for obstruction." There it was again. The threat, the leverage, the reminder that he had power and she didn't. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, something that had been forming since the moment the Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon. A hardness, a recognition that she couldn't trust authority, that systems designed to protect people actually protected the people who operated them, and that her only real option was to document everything and prepare for the worst. "I'm cooperating fully," she said, each word clipped and precise. "I'm providing all requested documentation. I'm allowing you to inspect my vessel. I'm answering your questions. What I'm doing is asking questions about the legal basis for the investigation. That's not obstruction. That's the exercise of my civil rights." The younger officer shifted slightly and Sarah caught it. He seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, seemed to recognize that the senior officer was crossing some line, but he said nothing. He remained positioned in the doorway, blocking her exit, silently complicit through inaction. "I'm going to radio for a backup unit," the senior officer announced, keying his radio handset. "We're going to need additional personnel to secure the vessel and catalog the inventory." The words landed like a threat. Secure the vessel, catalog the inventory. Language designed to make this sound official, routine, standard procedure. But Sarah understood what he was actually saying. They were preparing to confiscate her boat. They were preparing to treat her like a criminal, to remove her from her own property, to conduct the kind of thorough search that would require hours and would leave her sanctuary violated and exposed. She thought of her savings accounts, the minimal ones. She thought of her legal knowledge, which extended to combat law and military regulations but not maritime civilian law. She thought of Ahmed, of Marcus, of Alina, of James, and of David, and she felt the weight of survival pressing down on her again, the sense that the world was fundamentally unsafe, that authorities were fundamentally unreliable, that she was fundamentally alone. "Backup en route," crackled through the radio. "ETA 8 minutes." 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, her boat would be swarming with federal officers. In 8 minutes, her home would become a crime scene. In 8 minutes, every carefully constructed barrier between herself and the outside world would be compromised. And there was nothing she could do to stop it, because she'd followed all the rules, because the system had failed her, because authority ultimately cared nothing for fairness or justice or the humanity of the people it governed. Sarah stood very still, her hands at her sides, and waited for the violation to begin in earnest. The 8 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah remained standing in her cabin, watching the senior officer continue his methodical documentation of everything aboard the Perseverance. He photographed her books, dog-eared paperbacks on military history, psychology, trauma recovery. He photographed her clothing, her minimal personal effects, the single photograph she kept tucked in her bunk frame. A faded Polaroid of her unit in the mountains of Kandahar, 5 faces smiling at a camera, 4 of them no longer alive. The younger officer never took his eyes off her. He was reading her, analyzing her, waiting for the moment when she would crack or cry or show some emotion that would confirm his superior officer's suspicions. Sarah kept her face a mask. She'd learned this skill in interrogation training, the art of being present in her body while being absent from her mind. She stared at a point on the cabin wall just above his head and let herself drift into the detached space where feelings couldn't touch her. The sound of the second Coast Guard vessel arriving pulled her back to the present. Through the porthole, she could see 2 more officers boarding a second rubber boat, preparing to come alongside the Perseverance. This was no longer an inspection. This was a full-scale federal response to what they perceived as a threat. The irony was suffocating. She, who had spent 15 years protecting national security, was now being treated like a threat to it. The additional officers arrived with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. They carried equipment, metal cases, clipboards, portable scanning devices. They moved through the boat with the purposefulness of people executing a plan, not investigating a crime. Sarah understood that they were looking for contraband, for weapons, for evidence of human trafficking or drug smuggling or terrorism, or any of the myriad illegal activities that might justify the kind of response they were mounting. They opened every cabinet. They examined her food stores. They looked through her navigation charts, her weather logs, her engine maintenance records, all perfectly legal, all perfectly documented. The senior officer stood in the galley directing the operation like a general commanding troops. The younger officer remained near Sarah, but now his expression had shifted. He'd begun to realize that they weren't finding anything. No weapons, no drugs, no contraband. No evidence of any violation except for the permit discrepancy that seemed increasingly like a bureaucratic error rather than criminal negligence. But stopping now would mean admitting that the officer had overreacted, that he'd escalated the situation unnecessarily, that he'd violated the privacy and autonomy of a citizen based on faulty information. Sarah understood that government employees, like all humans, had a vested interest in protecting their own actions, in justifying their decisions, in finding something, anything, that would explain the level of response they'd initiated. One of the new officers emerged from the cabin holding her personal documents folder, the one that contained her birth certificate, her social security information, and the other identifying materials that a person needed to maintain a functioning existence in American society. ID request, the officer announced, handing the folder to the senior officer. We'll need to verify her identity against federal databases. The senior officer nodded and turned to Sarah, his expression hardening further. I'll need all forms of identification, driver's license, passport, anything else you have. Sarah retrieved her wallet from her bunk and handed over her driver's license. She watched as the officer examined it with the intensity of someone looking for a fake ID at a bar. He scanned it with one of the portable devices, waited for the information to process, nodded at whatever the database returned. Massachusetts license, he noted. You're a long way from home. I chose to be, Sarah said quietly. He studied her for a moment, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. She looked at her license in his hands, at the photograph from 2 years ago, at the address that was no longer relevant. The license showed her full name, Sarah Catherine Mitchell. No military designation, no indication of her background or credentials. Just a woman, alone, on a boat, no visible means of support that they'd been able to identify yet. You have any military identification? He asked, almost casually, as though it was an afterthought rather than a line of questioning he'd been building toward. The words landed between them like an object dropped from a great height. Sarah felt her entire body go still. This was the moment. This was the choice point. She could tell him no, could maintain her separation from that part of her life, could accept whatever consequences followed from being just another civilian with an outdated permit. Or she could step back into that identity, could reassert her credentials, could use the only leverage she possessed. For 3 years, she tried to be just Sarah, just the quiet woman on the boat, just a person who'd left the military behind and was trying to exist in the world on her own terms. She'd hoped that by separating herself completely from that identity, she could escape its weight, its obligations, its complications. But as she stood in her own cabin, surrounded by federal officers, her sanctuary violated and her autonomy stripped away, she understood that there was no real separation. You couldn't just abandon who you'd been. That identity didn't work that way. It followed you. It shaped you. It was part of the fundamental architecture of who you were. Yes, she said quietly, I have military identification. The senior officer's expression shifted, barely perceptibly, but Sarah caught it. He'd been expecting either a no or an evasion, not a confirmation, not a willingness to provide additional documentation. Go ahead, he said, gesturing for her to retrieve it. Sarah moved toward her bunk and reached for the small wooden box tucked beneath it, the one that contained the symbols of her old life, her retired military ID card, her commendation medals, her discharge papers, her security clearance documentation. She withdrew the ID card carefully as though it was a live explosive and handed it to the senior officer. He took it with fingers that remained steady, but his eyes widened as he read the designation. United States Special Operations Command. The words seemed to glow on the plastic card. Her photograph, much younger, much harder, in dress uniform. Her classification level stamped in red ink. The authority embedded in the document. The younger officer leaned over to look, and Sarah watched the color drain from his face. The other two officers, who'd been continuing their search, seemed to sense something and paused, watching to see what the senior officer would do next. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, to become more substantial, as though the revelation of those credentials had physically altered the space. "Captain Mitchell," the senior officer finally said, his voice completely different now, careful, measured, respectful. I wasn't aware of your background." Sarah took the ID card back, feeling the weight of it in her hand, feeling the way it immediately reoriented the entire situation. These men were no longer inspecting her. They were now in the presence of someone with authority they could understand, credentials they recognized, a clearance level that suggested classified access to information they would never possess. The younger officer had actually taken a step backward, as though physical distance might help him process what was happening. "Is there anything else you need?" Sarah asked, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly professional, perfectly aware that she just reclaimed a piece of her identity she tried so hard to discard. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of men recalibrating their understanding of a situation, the silence of federal employees suddenly aware that they might have made a career-defining mistake. The younger officer had actually taken another step backward, creating more distance between himself and Sarah, as though proximity to someone with her credentials might somehow implicate him further in whatever injustice was about to unfold. Sarah watched the senior officer's face work through a series of expressions, confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been fear. He looked down at the ID card in his hand, then back at her, then down at the card again, as though the repeated viewing might somehow change what he was seeing. The United States Special Operations Command seal didn't become less official with repeated examination. The classification stamps didn't fade. The authority embedded in that laminated card remained immutable and undeniable. "I wasn't aware," he said carefully, each word now measured and precise in a way it hadn't been before, "of your background." Sarah took the card back, sliding it into her wallet with deliberate slowness. She said nothing. She understood the power of silence now, understood that in this moment her refusal to speak was more intimidating than anything she could say. These men had violated her space, had treated her like a criminal, had called for backup to secure her vessel, and they'd done it to someone with clearance levels that suggested access to classified information they couldn't even comprehend. One of the other officers was radioing back to the cutter. "Stand down on the backup," he said carefully. We're going to be wrapping this up. Just stand by." Sarah noticed the hesitation, the uncertainty that had crept into his voice. The backup that had been called with such confidence, the additional resources that had been summoned to secure her vessel and catalog her possessions, all of that was being quietly reversed. The conversation that followed was barely audible, but she could hear the shift in tone from the responding officers. Whatever they were being told made clear that the situation had changed fundamentally. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Captain Mitchell," he said, and she noticed he was using her rank now, using the title that she'd earned through 15 years of service rather than simply calling her ma'am. "I want to sincerely apologize for the manner in which this inspection was conducted." The word was out now, apology, an admission of wrongdoing. Sarah remained silent, watching him squirm in his own discomfort. "The zone reclassification," he continued, his words coming faster now, as though speed might somehow mitigate the severity of what he'd done. That should have been communicated to existing permit holders. We've determined that the notification system failed in this case. Your permits were valid at the time of issuance. The reclassification that occurred afterward was administrative oversight on the part of the Federal Registry. He was covering himself now, was creating a narrative that would protect him if Sarah decided to report this incident. He was acknowledging the error while simultaneously shifting blame to the Federal Registry, to the system, to abstract bureaucratic failures rather than to his own judgment. Sarah understood exactly what he was doing, because she'd done similar things herself, rewritten narratives to protect her position, to maintain plausible deniability, to ensure that responsibility flowed upward toward abstract institutions rather than backward toward personal accountability. "What you're saying," Sarah said slowly, "is that I did nothing wrong." "That's correct," the senior officer confirmed, and there was visible relief in his voice at her willingness to engage in conversation. "You are not in violation. Your vessel is not subject to seizure. I apologize for the inconvenience and the invasive nature of this inspection." The younger officer had moved to the cabin entrance, physically positioning himself out of the way. Sarah could see him making mental calculations about how this incident would play out, whether it would impact his career, whether he should have objected to his superior officer's escalation. She felt a small flicker of pity for him. He was young enough that he might still believe the system was designed to protect the innocent, that authority was meant to be wielded justly. "I'm going to need the permits updated," Sarah said, shifting into a businesslike tone that she'd once used in military briefings. It was a tone that expected compliance, that didn't question whether requests would be fulfilled. "And I'll need documentation that this vessel was cleared of any violations." "Of course," the senior officer said immediately. "I'll personally ensure that you receive the updated permits and a written statement of clearance. I can have them delivered to your boat within 2 hours." 2 hours. He'd gone from threatening seizure to promising expedited service. The power inversion was complete. Sarah was no longer a suspect. She was a decorated veteran with access to information they couldn't access, with authority they couldn't challenge, with credentials that meant she could make their lives extremely difficult if she chose to do so. The irony was suffocating. 3 years of trying to exist outside of that identity. 3 years of attempting to be just a regular person following the rules and minding her own business, and it had taken her military credentials to protect her from federal agents who were supposed to protect citizens. The system didn't care about fairness or basic human decency, or the fact that she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. It cared about credentials and clearance levels, and the unspoken understanding that certain people had access to information that made them untouchable. The officers began moving toward the cabin exit, preparing to leave. The search that had been so thorough moments ago was abandoned completely. They hadn't found anything illegal, but now that legal status had been overridden by something more important, her military status. "We'll get those permits to you," the senior officer said, offering an apologetic smile that felt completely hollow. "Again, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She watched them file out of her cabin, watched the younger officer avoid her eyes as he passed. She waited until she heard the rubber boats pulling away from the Perseverance, until the sounds of the Coast Guard cutters preparing to depart had faded into the afternoon air. Only then did she move to her bunk and retrieve the wooden box again. She held the ID card in her hands, looking at the photograph of the younger Sarah, the one in dress uniform, the one with the dangerous eyes, the one who'd been trained to kill and had become very good at it. That woman stared back at her from the laminated surface, and Sarah understood that she'd never really left. She'd simply been dormant, waiting beneath the surface for the moment when civility and justice failed, and the only language remaining was authority and power. She placed the card back in the box and sat on the edge of her bunk, feeling the weight of 3 years of attempted healing suddenly evaporate. The sanctuary had been violated. The woman in the shadows had been forced into the light. And now, sitting in the cabin of her beloved boat, Sarah felt something crucial break inside her, the fragile belief that it was possible to just walk away from who you'd been and become someone new. The Perseverance rocked gently on the water, but Sarah felt anything but peaceful. She'd won the confrontation. The officers had backed down. Her boat would be cleared. But the cost of that victory was the recognition that the only thing that had saved her from federal overreach was the very military identity she'd been trying to escape. She put her face in her hands and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to cry. The permits arrived exactly 90 minutes later, hand-delivered by a different Coast Guard officer. A woman this time, senior enough to understand the implications of what had transpired, careful enough to show respect but not so servile as to acknowledge the fundamental wrongdoing that had occurred. She placed the paperwork on the galley table and didn't linger, understanding that her presence was an uncomfortable reminder of what the Coast Guard had done. Sarah sat alone in her cabin with the documentation spread before her. The permits were current now, updated through the proper channels, bearing the official seals and signatures that indicated her right to be in the waters she'd been safely navigating for 3 years. Attached was a letter from the senior officer, carefully worded to acknowledge administrative error and communication failure, without ever admitting that he and his team had violated her rights. The letter also included, probably on advice from some Coast Guard legal department, an implicit acknowledgement that she would not pursue formal complaints or legal action. The offer hung between the lines. Your permits are updated and you're cleared. Now let this go and forget it happened. Sarah understood the message perfectly. She was being allowed to win quietly, to accept the victory privately, to maintain the fiction that everything had been a simple misunderstanding. In exchange, she would not invoke her military connections to make their lives difficult. She would not file complaints with federal oversight committees. She would not use her clearance access to research whether this kind of overreach was standard practice. She would simply accept the apology and move on. The bitterness of it sat heavy in her stomach. She spent the evening walking on the dock, moving past other boats where people were preparing dinner or settling in for the night. She saw families, couples, solo sailors who'd chosen the water for reasons both similar and completely different from her own. She wondered how many of them would have had the same outcome if they'd been in her position. How many would have had their boats seized? How many would have spent months in legal battles trying to prove their innocence? How many would still be fighting federal charges over a permit that was valid when it was issued? The answer felt obvious, and it filled her with a rage that was sharp and cold and entirely different from the anger she'd felt during the inspection. That anger had been reactive, immediate, a response to violation. This anger was structural. This anger was about systems, about justice, about the fundamental inequality of how the law was applied depending on who you were and what credentials you possessed. She thought about the young Coast Guard officer, the one who'd looked uncomfortable with his superior officer's escalation. He probably hadn't slept well either. He probably had recognized that something wasn't right about the situation, that they were treating a woman who'd done nothing wrong like a criminal. But recognition wasn't the same as resistance. He'd remained silent. He'd participated in the violation by not objecting to it. He'd been complicit through his inaction. Sarah understood this better than most. She'd been trained to follow orders, to execute plans, to trust the chain of command. She'd also been trained to question orders when they violated military law. But in civilian spaces, the rules were different. Civilians weren't trained to object to authority. They were socialized to comply, to assume that authority was legitimate, to trust that the system had their best interests in mind. The system didn't have their best interests in mind. Sarah understood this with absolute clarity now. She returned to the boat and sat in the cabin, reading through the permit documentation one more time. The language was almost mocking in its ordinariness. The zone reclassification was described in clinical, bureaucratic terms. Due to increased marine traffic and environmental protection protocols, the following coordinates have been reclassified from unrestricted anchorage to restricted status. Nowhere in the document was there any mention of notification procedures. Nowhere was there any acknowledgement of the gap in communication that had created her violation. This was how the system protected itself, not through explicit dishonesty, but through the strategic omission of relevant facts, through the use of passive voice that obscured agency, through bureaucratic language that transformed the failure to notify permit holders into a simple classification update, through systems designed by people with power for the protection of people with power, regardless of whom they hurt in the process. Sarah thought about the other boat captains in the harbor, the ones who'd been operating under the same outdated permits, the ones who might not have military credentials to fall back on. Had any of them been confronted by the Coast Guard? Had any of them had their boats searched? Were there other violations being cataloged, other people being treated like suspects in their own homes? She made a decision that night, a decision that surprised her even as she made it. Instead of letting this fade into the background, instead of accepting the implicit bargain that the Coast Guard letter was offering, she was going to investigate whether this kind of overreach was standard practice. She was going to document what had happened. She was going to find out whether the notification system truly had failed or whether it had simply never existed. But more than that, she was going to understand what could have happened to her if she didn't have a military ID card, if she didn't have security clearances, if she didn't have the kind of credentials that commanded respect from federal agents. The realization was devastating. Her sanctuary hadn't actually protected her. Her careful isolation hadn't actually kept her safe. The only thing that had protected her was the very identity she'd been trying to escape. And there were thousands, maybe millions of people without that protection, people vulnerable to the same kind of violation she'd experienced, people who wouldn't have a federal officer showing up with apologies and updated permits. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself researching maritime law, federal administrative procedures, and the rights of citizens in federal spaces. She contacted maritime safety organizations and began asking questions about notification procedures. She discovered that the Coast Guard zone reclassification system was indeed as broken as she'd suspected. Notices were filed in federal registries that most people never checked. Existing permit holders weren't notified, and the burden of staying current fell entirely on the individual rather than on the system designed to inform them. She also discovered that complaints about Coast Guard harassment during inspections were not uncommon. Most were filed by people who couldn't afford lawyers, whose complaints got lost in bureaucratic channels, whose vessels sometimes were seized anyway, whose lives were damaged by the slow machinery of federal justice. By the end of the week, Sarah had made another decision, one that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She was going to use the very credentials that had saved her as a tool to protect other people. She was going to step back into a version of her former identity, not as a soldier, but as an advocate. She was going to ensure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen to others. But first, she needed to grieve the woman she'd been trying to become. She needed to acknowledge that the peaceful life on the Perseverance, the woman in the shadows who asked for nothing and wanted nothing, that version of herself was no longer possible. The Coast Guard had changed that. The system had forced her hand. That night, Sarah looked at her reflection in the cabin window, the glass dark against the night sky, and saw not the peaceful sailor she'd been trying to be, but the officer she'd always been underneath. The woman who'd been trained to lead, to act, to make a difference even when the personal cost was high. She didn't like her reflection, but she recognized it. And she understood, with a clarity that came from 3 years of painful healing, that some battles couldn't be escaped. Some injustices had to be addressed. Some wounds could only be healed by transforming them into action. The Perseverance rocked gently on the water, and Sarah began to plan her next move. The first person Sarah helped was a retired accountant named Robert Chen, who'd purchased a small cabin cruiser as his retirement dream. He'd received the same zone reclassification notice that Sarah had, or rather, he hadn't received it. He'd simply shown up in what he thought were legal waters and found himself with a boat seized by the Coast Guard, facing federal violations and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. When Sarah met him at the Marina coffee shop, he was broken in a way that reminded her of herself from 3 years ago. Defeated, confused, convinced that the system was designed to punish him specifically. Sarah spent 3 weeks helping Robert navigate the Coast Guard's appeals process, documenting the notification failures, and filing formal complaints through federal channels. She used her clearance access to research whether this pattern was systemic, and she discovered that it was. She found 17 cases of vessel seizure in Oregon alone in the past 2 years, all stemming from the same broken notification system. 17 people whose boats had been confiscated, whose lives had been disrupted, whose trust in authority had been shattered. Robert's case was ultimately successful. His boat was returned, his violations were dismissed, and he received written acknowledgement from the Coast Guard that the notification system had failed. But the victory felt hollow to Sarah because it only addressed one person, one incident, one moment of injustice among thousands that were happening simultaneously across the country. She decided to expand her work. She began attending Maritime Safety Board meetings, initially as an observer, eventually as a vocal advocate for better notification procedures. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests for Coast Guard inspection records, documenting patterns of violation and overreach. She started a blog detailing the legal rights of boat owners, the proper procedures for permits, the regulations that seemed designed to trap innocent people. The blog was read by thousands. She received emails from people in Massachusetts, California, Florida, Texas, all with similar stories, all grateful to finally understand what had happened to them. Within 6 months, Sarah had become known in maritime safety circles as an expert on regulatory compliance and federal overreach. She was invited to speak at conferences. She began consulting with attorneys who represented clients in maritime disputes. She helped craft legislation that would require the Coast Guard to notify existing permit holders before reclassifying zones. She became something she'd never anticipated, a voice for people who had no voice, a guide for people lost in bureaucratic systems, a protector of people vulnerable to federal authority. But her work didn't stop at maritime law. Working with the advocacy organizations put her in contact with other veterans struggling to transition to civilian life. She recognized in them the same disconnection she'd experienced, the same sense that civilian existence was incomprehensible, the same underlying trauma that military service had embedded in their nervous systems. She began mentoring them, not as a therapist, because she wasn't qualified for that and would have rejected the role anyway, but as someone who understood, someone who'd been where they were, someone who could offer perspective on how to exist in a world that didn't make sense. She started a monthly gathering at the Marina, no official title, no therapeutic language, just veterans showing up to talk about their experiences over coffee. Sarah provided space and listening, and that was enough. She didn't pretend to have answers. She didn't offer platitudes about healing or recovery. She simply created a space where men and women who'd seen combat could sit together without judgment and acknowledge that coming home was harder than going to war. One of the veterans who attended regularly was Michael Torres, a former Marine who'd been severely injured in an IED explosion and had struggled for 5 years to find purpose in his life after medical discharge. Michael had been on the edge of suicide when he found Sarah's blog about maritime rights. He'd reached out, they'd talked for hours, and she'd invited him to the monthly gatherings. 3 months later, Michael was working with Sarah on maritime advocacy, researching Coast Guard procedures, helping other veterans navigate federal systems. "You saved my life," Michael told her one afternoon, sitting on the deck of the Perseverance, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. Sarah shook her head. "You saved your own life. I just gave you something to do, something that mattered. There's a difference." But she understood what he meant. Purpose was life-sustaining in a way that peace wasn't. Action was healing in a way that rest couldn't be. The woman who'd spent 3 years trying to disappear into silence had learned that salvation came not from running away, but from turning around and facing the things that had broken her, transforming them into something that could help others. Her work began to attract attention from larger organizations. A national veterans advocacy group invited her to join their board. A maritime safety nonprofit asked her to lead their regulatory compliance initiative. A university approached her about teaching a seminar on federal administrative law and how it affected vulnerable populations. Each invitation felt both terrifying and inevitable, like she was being pulled inexorably toward a version of herself that could make a difference. Sarah accepted all of it. She began splitting her time between the Perseverance and an office in Portland. She hired an assistant to help manage the growing volume of requests from people seeking help navigating maritime regulations. She created templates and guides that made the process simpler for the next person facing the same injustice. She worked with congressional representatives to push for legislation requiring clearer notification procedures. She became, without ever intending to, a leader in the field of maritime regulatory reform. But she never abandoned the boat. The Perseverance remained her anchor, the physical manifestation of her survival, the place where she returned to remember who she'd been and why the work mattered. She still maintained the engine herself. She still sailed in the quiet moments before dawn or after dusk. She still kept the bunk where she'd cried 3 years ago, where she'd grieved the woman she'd been trying to become. What changed was the weight she carried. The trauma didn't disappear, it transformed. The violation she'd experienced became fuel. The anger at systemic injustice became motivation. The understanding that credentials mattered more than humanity became evidence of what needed to change. And the woman who'd tried to disappear into the water eventually understood that the only way forward was to stand visible and use her voice, her authority, and her experience to protect others from the violation that had fractured her. On the 3-year anniversary of the Coast Guard inspection, Sarah stood on the deck of the Perseverance at sunset. She thought about how far she'd come, not in healing, because healing was never really complete, but in purpose. She thought about Robert Chen, whose boat had been returned. She thought about Michael Torres, who was alive because he'd found something to live for. She thought about the 17 cases she'd helped resolve, the dozens more she'd documented, the hundreds of people reading her blog and learning their rights. She thought about the senior Coast Guard officer, who'd likely moved on to another posting, another position, another opportunity to violate citizens he saw as threats. The system that had created him would continue creating people like him until the system itself was changed. And that change was possible because people like Sarah were willing to step into the light and fight. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The water reflected the colors like a mirror, and Sarah felt something settle inside her. Not peace, exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that her life would be defined by this work. Acceptance that true healing came through helping others heal. Acceptance that the woman in the shadows had finally found a reason to stand in the light. The Perseverance rocked gently on the evening tide, and Sarah watched the light fade, knowing that tomorrow would bring new battles, new people to help, new systems to challenge. And she was ready.